In 1998, the state of Florida shut off the pumps that had kept 20,000 acres of farmland dry for over 50 years and let the water come back. The fields along the northern shore of Lake Apopka, productive muck farms that had grown corn, carrots, and celery since World War II, went under. 20,000 acres of agriculture drowned on purpose. It sounds like destruction. And for the first few months, it looked like destruction. Within a single winter, over 1,000 birds, white pelicans, endangered wood storks, great blue herons dropped dead across the newly flooded ground, poisoned by pesticides that had been sitting in the soil since before most of them were born. Federal investigators opened a criminal case against the agency that ordered the flooding. But the farmland wasn't flooded to create a sanctuary. It was flooded because the farms themselves had spent half a century poisoning the fourth largest lake in Florida, and stopping the poison was only the beginning. Engineers would need to build a 760-acre artificial wetland to filter a lake 40 times its size. They would need to hire commercial fishermen to haul 750,000 pounds of fish out of the water every year, because the fish themselves were recycling the poison right back into the water. And they would need to bury 4,000 acres of toxic soil without removing a single truckload. No plant had grown on the bottom of Lake Apopka since the early 1950s. The question was whether an operation this complex could undo 50 years of collapse and whether anything buried that long could still come back. Before the drainage, Lake Apopka was 30,800 acres of clear water sitting 15 miles northwest of Orlando. Dense beds of eelgrass and pondweed blanketed the lake floor, their roots locking sediment in place while their leaves absorbed nutrients from the water column. The transparency drew largemouth bass. The bass drew anglers. 21 commercial fish camps operated along the shoreline, and the lake was Central Florida's original tourist economy, decades before anyone broke ground on a theme park. Then the war changed the math. In the early 1940s, federal production quotas drove the state to drain the 20,000-acre marsh along the lake's northern shore, the natural floodplain that had filtered every drop of water entering the basin for centuries. Engineers built dikes, cut canals, and laid drainage networks to convert that marshland into some of the most productive cropland in the southeast. The exposed soil was pure organic muck, black, rich, and perfect for row agriculture. But muck sits below the water table. To keep the fields workable, farmers ran massive pumps around the clock, shoving millions of gallons of nutrient-loaded runoff straight back into the lake. The muck farms alone were responsible for nearly 60% of the total phosphorus entering Lake Apopka, roughly 46,000 kilograms per year. And the farms relied on more than fertilizer. Persistent pesticides, DDT, toxaphene, dieldrin, chlordane, were sprayed from crop dusters that flew directly over field crews. Farm workers, drawn largely from African American and Haitian communities in Zellwood and Apopka, reported being coated in chemical residue until their skin felt sticky. Community health surveys later documented devastating clusters of lupus, cancer, and respiratory illness among these workers and their families, driven by the same chemicals that researchers would find deforming the reproductive systems of alligators living in the lake. For a few seasons, the lake absorbed the phosphorus. Then, in 1947, a hurricane ripped through central Florida and tore what remained of the eelgrass off the bottom. The accumulated phosphorus ignited the first massive algal bloom the lake had ever experienced. The water went opaque. Without sunlight reaching the bottom, the uprooted vegetation couldn't regenerate. By the early 1950s, every rooted plant in the lake was gone. What replaced them was worse than bare mud. Billions of dead algae cells settled and built a layer of fluid mud on the lake floor, roughly 98% water, so loose that any wind turned it back into the water column. Every time that happened, the resuspended muck released stored phosphorus, feeding the next bloom. The loop that had run in the right direction for centuries, clear water feeds plants, plants hold sediment, sediment stays down, was now running in reverse. Algae fed the mud fed the algae, and nothing inside the system could break the cycle. The base vanished, all 21 fish camps closed. By 1985, Lake Apopka held the title of Florida's most polluted large lake, and the pumps on the North Shore kept running. Early regulatory efforts targeted the obvious sources, a sewage treatment plant, a citrus processing facility, but together those accounted for less than 20% of the phosphorus load. The water quality barely moved. Regulators had been treating symptoms. The main artery, 20,000 acres of agricultural runoff, kept pumping unchecked. The lake wasn't just polluted, it was mechanically broken, running a self-reinforcing destruction cycle that no single fix could interrupt. In 1996, the Florida legislature ordered the state to buy the farms. Over the next 3 years, the St. Johns River Water Management District spent $90 million acquiring the muck farmland along the North Shore. The pumps went silent. The single largest source of phosphorus, nearly 60% of the total external load, was permanently eliminated. The plan was to let water return and convert the drained fields back into the marsh they had been before the 1940s. In the summer of 1998, the district stopped the drainage pumps and let the North Shore flood. It was supposed to be a turning point. Within weeks, tens of thousands of migratory birds descended on the new shallows: pelicans, herons, wood storks, bald eagles. Audubon counted some of the highest inland bird numbers in the state's history. Then, between November 1998 and April 1999, over 1,000 of those birds died. The mechanism was brutally straightforward. Half a century of pesticide application had saturated the topsoil with compounds that do not decompose. When the fields flooded, small fish moved into the shallow water and ingested contaminated sediment. The birds ate the fish. The poison concentrated as it climbed the food chain, and the birds at the top received lethal doses of chemicals that had been locked in the dirt for decades. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. The reflooding was halted. The district drained the fields and faced a problem that looked unsolvable. 4,000 acres of topsoil, too poisoned to flood, too expensive to dig up. Standard excavation, trucking contaminated earth to a lined landfill, was priced at over $100,000 per acre. For 4,000 acres, the bill would exceed $800 million. The solution was mechanical and radical. Engineers brought in massive tractors pulling custom moldboard plows fitted with blades over 4 feet wide. These plows cut a full meter into the ground and physically flipped the entire soil column, a precise 180-degree rotation that buried the poisoned topsoil under a thick cap of clean clay and sand pulled up from below. The operation cost between $1,500 and $2,700 per acre. By 2009, 4,000 acres had been inverted, and surface pesticide concentrations dropped by 68%, enough to safely resume flooding without killing the wildlife it was supposed to protect. But silencing the farms and burying the poison only addressed the external problem. 60 years of phosphorus had already accumulated inside the lake, dissolved in the water column, stored in the fluid mud on the bottom. The bleeding had stopped. The infection had not. The answer was a structure called the Marsh Flowway. 760 acres of engineered wetland divided into 4 parallel treatment cells, constructed on the southwest corner of the North Shore. It came online in November 2003 and has been running continuously since. The mechanism is straightforward. Lake water is drawn into the cells, where dense vegetation, pickerelweed, arrowhead, cattail slows the flow to a crawl. At that reduced speed, suspended algae and fine particles physically drop out of the water and become trapped in the marsh soil. The plants themselves pull dissolved phosphorus and nitrogen through their roots. The cleaned water is then pumped back into the lake. 760 acres filtering a lake of 30,800. 1 acre of kidney for roughly every 40 acres of water. That ratio sounds insufficient. But the flowway processes between 30 and 40% of the entire lake's volume every year. By 2019, it had removed over 77,000 tons of suspended solids, 1,500 tons of nitrogen, and nearly 39 tons of phosphorus from the water. That is a staggering volume of material for a wetland you could walk across in 20 minutes. But even with the farms dead and the kidney running, the lake stayed green. Water would clear for a stretch. Then the turbidity would spike again, as though something kept loading the system from inside. Something was. After the base fishery collapsed, one species filled the void: the gizzard shad, a small, silvery bottom-feeding fish that nobody targets, nobody eats, and nobody notices. In a healthy Florida lake, shad make up 5 to 20% of the fish population. In Lake Apopka, they accounted for over 90%. That imbalance was not just a symptom of the lake's collapse, it was actively preventing the recovery. Gizzard shad feed by vacuuming the organic muck off the lake bottom, the same fluid mud that stores decades of legacy phosphorus. Their digestive systems convert the locked-up nutrients into a soluble form and excrete it directly into the water, where algae can use it immediately. Meanwhile, the physical motion of millions of shad rooting through the sediment keeps the mud permanently stirred, blocking sunlight exactly the way the algae does. The shad were a living recycling system, scooping phosphorus off the bottom, processing it through their guts, and dumping it back into the water column in a form that immediately fed more blooms. The flowway could filter the surface. The shad kept reloading it from below. Starting in 1993, the Water Management District began paying commercial fishermen to remove them, not with rod and reel, with massive haul seines and gill nets run in industrial-scale sweeps across the lake. The mathematics are precise. Every 1,000,000 pounds of shad hauled from the water eliminates roughly 24,500 pounds of phosphorus from the system, 7,000 locked inside the fish's tissue. The rest prevented from ever being excreted back into the water column. The program pulls between 750,000 and 1,000,000 pounds of shad out of the lake annually. Since 1993, over 15 million pounds have been removed, extracting more than 274,000 pounds of phosphorus from the system. And the calibration runs deeper than tonnage. Researchers discovered that reducing the net mesh size by just 1.3 centimeters from 10.2 down to 8.9 increased phosphorus removal efficiency by 10 to 15%. The reason? Younger, smaller shad excrete significantly more phosphorus per gram of body weight than older fish. The engineers were not simply removing fish. They were tuning which fish to remove, down to the centimeter of mesh. The shad are not what returned to Lake Apopka. They are what had to be taken out, continuously, year after year, so that anything else could return. 3 systems, operating simultaneously, one to cut the external supply, one to filter the water column, one to break the internal recycling loop. None of them were building anything. All 3 were subtracting. Whether subtraction alone could trigger a lake to rebuild itself from biological memory buried 50 years deep in the mud, that was the question the engineering could not answer. For years, the answer appeared to be no. The farms were silent. The flowway was cycling. The shad were being hauled out by the 100,000-pound load, and the lake stayed green. Phosphorus concentrations dropped, but by single-digit percentages per year, barely visible against the enormous reservoir of legacy nutrients still circulating in the system. The district was spending over $1 million annually just maintaining the North Shore infrastructure, running pumps, monitoring soil chemistry in the inverted ground, adjusting flow through the marsh cells. The operation looked less like a recovery and more like permanent dialysis for a lake that might never wake up. But the deficit was compounding, phosphorus leaving faster than it entered, every year, grinding down the total concentration. Suspended solids thinning. Gradually, light started reaching depths it hadn't touched in decades. Then, in the late 2010s, something happened that nobody had budgeted for. Eelgrass started growing on the bottom of Lake Apopka, not from transplants, not from a planting crew. The first shoots emerged spontaneously from the lake bed, seeds that had been buried in the dark, airless mud since before the 1950s collapse, deposited by the last generation of plants that grew before the ecosystem flipped, began to germinate. The conditions that had preserved them were the same conditions that made the lake a dead zone: no oxygen, no light, sealed in chemical stasis for half a century. When the water finally cleared enough for sunlight to reach the sediment, the first seeds stirred. But it wasn't light alone. The shifting chemistry of the organic soil released trace amounts of ethylene gas from the decomposing muck, a natural signal that cracked the dormancy of seeds that had been waiting for 50 years. They had been waiting for a signal that took half a century to arrive. Plants grew on that lake bed for the first time since the Eisenhower administration. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission accelerated the process, hand-planting over 880,000 individual eelgrass and pondweed specimens into protected areas starting in 2017. But the wild germination from the dormant seed bank was the proof that the lake's biological memory had not been erased. It had been buried. And once the vegetation returned, it triggered the one feedback loop the engineers could never have built mechanically. The The roots of the eelgrass stabilized the fluid mud, physically preventing wind from churning it into the water. Less resuspension meant clearer water. Clearer water meant more light reaching the bottom. More light meant more plants. The loop that had run in the wrong direction for 50 years, algae, mud, turbidity, more algae, was now running in reverse. The engineering had not restored the lake. It had restored the conditions under which the lake could restore itself. Every rooted plant holding the mud down, every square meter of cleared water inviting the next generation of seeds, that was the lake's own machinery, running for the first time in half a century. The three systems built to subtract had unlocked a fourth system that could only add. By 2022, the mean annual phosphorus concentration in Lake Apopka dropped below the state's regulatory target for the first time in the lake's modern history, a 66 to 69% reduction from the late 1980s baseline. Water clarity increased by at least 50% across the board, with some measurements showing a 93% improvement. By 2024, native submerged vegetation was documented along 95% of the lake's 30,000-acre shoreline, flowering, seeding, expanding on its own after 50 continuous years of total absence. And then, the animals came back. The largemouth bass, the species that built the lake's original economy, functionally gone from its waters for more than half a century, returned. The state stocked over 1.4 million fingerlings in 2016 and 2017. Electrofishing surveys now show healthy fish reaching 16 inches within 2 years, with trophy specimens over 10 pounds caught regularly. Professional bass tournaments have returned to the lake for the first time since the collapse. On the flooded North Shore, the same ground where 1,000 birds died in the winter of 1998, the restored wetlands now host 372 documented bird species. The Lake Apopka Wildlife Drive, an 11-mile route through the reclaimed marsh, draws tens of thousands of visitors every year. And the wood stork, the federally endangered wading bird that was among the casualties of the 1998 die-off, recovered so thoroughly across restored habitats like the Apopka wetlands that in early 2026, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service officially removed it from the endangered species list. These are what returned. Not one species. Hundreds. Not despite the flooding, but because every system in the repair, the $90 million farm buyout, the 4,000-acre soil inversion, the 760-acre kidney, the annual fish harvest, addressed a different failure point, and not one of them would have worked alone. The lake is not fixed. It is managed, roughly $200 million across 4 decades, and the spending has not stopped. The shad harvest must continue annually, where the fish population rebounds and the internal recycling loop restarts within years. Invasive hydrilla now thrives in the cleared water, a new problem created directly by the success of the old solution, requiring constant chemical and mechanical control. Lake Apopka will need its artificial kidney and its commercial fishing fleet for the foreseeable future. But when every system is running, when every piece is operational, plants grow where nothing grew for 50 years. Bass swim where bass haven't been seen since before the moon landing, and 372 species of birds use the same ground that killed 1,000 of them 1 generation ago. The repair was never a single fix. It was 4 systems running in parallel, each one solving a problem the others could not reach, none of them optional, none of them finished. That is not restoration. That is terraforming. The planet is full of systems this broken. The engineering required to bring them back is more complex, more unglamorous, and more interesting than anyone expects. If that is the kind of thing that holds your attention, subscribe.